Imagine being really tired. You know that feeling when your eyes just doesn't want to stay open and you just keep nodding off. Well, now imagine that you're feeling like that, but you're in charge of a 50-ton aircraft that is just about to start a quite unusual and demanding type of approach in really poor weather. Stay tuned. In order to explain how this accident flight came to be, I have to start by explaining a bit about its background. You see, during the early 1990s, the meat industry was undergoing a big change inside of the United Kingdom. Prior to this, there had been more than 1,000 slaughterhouses available inside of the UK borders, but because of more lax regulations that had been implemented after the UK joined the European community, several of those had gone out of business, and this had caused long waiting times and higher costs for the UK meat producers. As a consequence of this, live cattle had started to be transported to slaughterhouses outside of the UK borders to, among other places, the Netherlands, France and even Spain. These transports could easily take up to 24 hours or even more, and the animals were often left without food or water during that time, leading to a lot of unnecessary suffering. Animal rights groups had noticed this practice and started several campaigns to try and highlight this to the general public, which had succeeded. Huge protests followed in several parts of the country, mainly outside ports and railway stations where these type of transports originated from. Those protests eventually caused several transport companies, mainly those who also transported people, to ban these type of transport. But that in turn just meant that the livestock companies now needed to find other ways to get their animals to the slaughterhouses in Europe. In August of 1994, one of these companies reached out to a transport company called Phoenix Aviation to see if they would be able to transport some calves by air, primarily down to Amsterdam from the UK. Phoenix Aviation was a charter organization and it didn't have its own air operator certificate, which is something that you need if you intend to operate your own aircraft or crew. Instead, they relied on contracting other airlines to operate their charters, and they normally work with different African airlines. An agreement was quickly struck to carry out continuous daily flights, initially between Bournemouth and Amsterdam using a cargo-converted Boeing 737-200 from Air Algerie. Air Algerie would provide the aircraft and the operating crews, but Phoenix Aviation would stand for all of the other costs. The converted Boeing 737-200 was able to transport 191 animals per flight in 6 palletized pens, and the plan was to operate flights every 4 hours throughout the day and night in order to fill the quota of 5,000 livestock transported per week. To handle the animals during the flight, 2 cattle handlers would be sitting in the back of the aircraft, meaning that each flight would have a total of 5 people on board. The pilot, an engineer who would handle refueling and minor technical fixes, and the 2 handlers. The operation was scheduled to start in October 1994, but due to some ingenious paperwork exercises involving several different air operator certificates, the actual approval for operating these flights had not yet been secured when the flights actually started. Anyway, the aircraft arrived in Bournemouth on the 20th of October 1994 and started operating the cargo flights immediately. But pretty soon a problem arose, because the purpose of the flights had quickly spread among the general public, causing local opposition and protests. This soon prompted Phoenix Aviation to switch operating base from Bournemouth to Coventry Airport, which was a bit closer to their own headquarters. The same type of local opposition obviously quickly sprung up there as well, but Phoenix successfully won a court case approving them to continue the operation, and after that Coventry became the de facto base of these cargo flights. Now, even though Phoenix Aviation had legally won the right to operate from Coventry, there were still considerable protests happening outside of the airport, especially around the departure times, and that required police presence. And this brings us to the aircraft in question. The aircraft had registration 7 Tango Victor Echo Echo and was, like I mentioned before, a Boeing 737-200 which had been manufactured back in 1973 and been with Algerie ever since. It was in generally good working condition, but already back in 1994 this was a quite antiquated aircraft with only a very rudimentary autopilot and flight director system. The cockpit was completely original, with steam gauges, and its ILS receivers and control boxes were also from the 70s, which will become very important in this story. You see, when the Instrument Landing System, ILS, was first introduced, it was allocated a frequency range in the VHF band between 108.1 to 111.9 MHz. It was decided that 20 channels should be enough, so an ILS frequency was dedicated to every odd decimal value, 108.1, 108.3 and so on. But it very soon became clear that more channels than that would be needed. So in 1976, 20 more channels were introduced and allocated frequencies 0.05 MHz above the existing frequencies, meaning 108.15, 108.35 and so on. But in order for these new channels to work, the aircraft needed to upgrade both the ILS receiver and its control boxes. On the accident aircraft, the control boxes had not been upgraded, meaning that only certain ILSs could be flown, those corresponding with the old channels. The ILS frequency in Coventry was 109.75, and that meant that the Air Algerie crews who were going to operate into there would not be able to use the ILS, which would become a problem given the UK wintertime weather. So, if the normal ILS system didn't work, which was by far the most common, easy way for the aircraft to be guided down towards the runway, well then, what would they going to use? Well, the second best thing, providing there was no VOR approach available, was something known as a surveillance radar approach, or SRA. As the name suggests, this is a radar-led type of approach, where the radar operator in the tower will give verbal instructions to the pilots on how to maneuver the aircraft horizontally to maintain the center line. The radar operator will also give the pilots guidance on which altitudes they should be at given distances from a DME station, but during the approach there's no way for the radar operator to actually see what altitudes that the aircraft is flying, so the pilots will have to monitor that by themselves. And because of that lack of vertical feedback, this type of approach is known as a non-precision approach and therefore had higher minimum descent height, or minima, which is the lowest altitude that the aircraft could legally descend to, as well as higher visibility requirements. During the final approach part of an SRA, there is no need for the pilots to read back the clearances because the transmission from air traffic control will be continuous and can sound something like this. 3 miles from touchdown, your height should be 950 feet, on track. Turn left heading 238, 238 is a heading. 2.5 miles from touchdown, your height should be 800 feet, and so on. The idea is that the pilot should try and adapt the descent rate to follow what we call a constant descent approach, meaning that they will fly with a descent that looks similar to what it would be like if they flew a normal ILS. There is also another way to fly a non-precision approach, and that's what we refer to as a dive and drive technique. In that case, the pilots can descend much quicker down to the published minima and then maintain that height in level flight until they either see the runway or reach a defined missed approach point. If they haven't been able to establish visual contact with the runway before reaching that point, well, then a go-around will be initiated. Now, both of these procedures are legal from a strict terrain clearance point of view, but the dive and drive technique will not conform to the stabilized approach criteria. Already back in 1994, most airlines had stopped flying approaches using that technique, but its existence is worth remembering for what's about to happen. Given the very rudimentary autopilot that was fitted to the 737-200, flying these SRAs could mean quite high workload for the pilots, and it was quite rare to even come across an SRA in real life. It was never really practiced in the simulator, and me personally, I've only flown one on a few times in my career, so the pilots wouldn't have been very used to them. The pilots who were going to operate Air Algerie Flight 702 Papa had arrived to the UK from Algeria a few days before the flight, on Sunday, the 18th of December 1994. The captain was 44 years old with 10,686 hours of total experience and 2,187 of those flown on the Boeing 737-200. He was accompanied by a 35-year-old first officer who had a total experience of 2,858 hours, of which the majority, 2,055 hours, were flown on the same aircraft. They had been allocated a hotel close to the airport, which was also where Air Algerie had set up their temporary base with briefing facilities and access to Phoenix Aviation representatives. The following day, Monday the 19th, they attended a briefing session in the morning before operating 4 sectors between Coventry and Amsterdam, starting at 12:30 and finishing their duty at 20:30 in the evening. The weather was beautiful during the day and no problems were reported. It is likely that they mostly flew visual approaches into Coventry on that day, and in Amsterdam the ILS frequency was compatible with the aircraft, so it could be flown without a problem. After the flights, the pilots were allocated more than 27 hours of rest until just before midnight the following evening, when they were scheduled for a night session of 4 more sectors to the same destination. Now, I really want to emphasize here that going from operating a day shift to a night shift can be really tricky from a rest perspective. Even though sufficient legal rest has been allocated, it doesn't necessarily mean that the pilots could get some actual sleep in the evening before their flights. In any case, the duty on the following day was scheduled with a check-in for the flight at 23:45, with the first departure at 30 minutes past midnight on the 21st. If everything went according to schedule, they would then arrive at 07:30 in the morning after the 4th flight, which was within the maximum duty time limitation for night flights in Air Algerie of 7 hours and 45 minutes after 4 sectors. Now, on top of that could be put a 5th sector in case of a diversion, and also a non-defined commander's discretion additive of duty time. But under UK legislation, this was limited to a maximum of 3 hours extra. Now, if this sounds like a lot, it is. But remember that this was back in 1994, and a lot of changes in duty time limitations have happened since then. And actually, what we are about to see happening to these pilots is an excellent example of why we have better flight time limitations today, and I'll tell you all about this after this. So, if you've been following my channels lately, you probably know that I am super invested in learning more about the use of AI and other technological advancements to improve my work. Keeping up with technological changes means acquiring new skills, and lately I've found that the best way to tackle this challenge is through Brilliant, today's sponsor. Brilliant offers thousands of quick, visual, hands-on lessons that you can access anytime, helping you to master key concepts in a fun and effective way. I must mention that the logic courses offered by Brilliant have significantly advanced my ability to structure my arguments and communicate my ideas more effectively, especially when presenting on camera. You can also access Brilliant on your phone, so instead of mindlessly scrolling through social media, I use those moments to level up my understanding of topics like, for example, computer science. Brilliant has become my go-to tool for continuous growth, and now you can try out everything that Brilliant has to offer absolutely for free for a full 30 days. Just head over to brilliant.org/mentorpilot or simply click on the link in the description below. Oh, and there's a special treat here. If you're among the first 200 to take advantage of this opportunity, you'll get a fantastic 20% discount on Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Huge shout out to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the story. The pilots and flight engineer arrived to the aircraft as planned around 23:45, but because of some issues with the loading of the livestock, the first departure became slightly delayed. The first officer was going to be pilot flying for the first 2 sectors, so he started setting up the cockpit for departure as the captain checked out the tech log and did the walk around. The aircraft had no written defects on it, but the ILS receiver had been changed a few weeks earlier in order to try and fix the issue with it, but because the control box had not also been changed, this had been unsuccessful. The first officer briefed and called for the checklist, and at time 0059 they finally took off from runway 23 and started their first flight down towards Amsterdam. There had been no real NOTAMs to take into account, and the weather was initially very nice, but there was a forecast of possible fog during the early morning hours later on. The aircraft landed safely in Amsterdam, unloaded the cargo, and then returned empty towards Coventry again. During the descent, they received the weather from the en route air traffic controller in London, and it was still beautiful, with 20 kilometers of visibility and a scattered cloud layer at 4,500 feet. The pilots tried to tune the ILS for the arrival, but as expected, it didn't work, and instead they opted for an SRA approach, which was conducted without any kind of problem. Records later showed that they had descended more or less exactly according to the constant descent profile, and they landed safely on runway 23 at time 0342. Now, before we continue, it's probably worth mentioning that the minimus used during an SRA approach depends on to which distance the radar controller continues the approach guidance. In the case of Coventry, this was either 650 feet height and 1,100 meters visibility for guidance to 2 nautical miles, or 370 feet height and the same visibility for a guidance to either 1 or half a nautical mile. Providing that this height was not crossed without positive visual contact with the runway, all obstacles in the approach area would be passed with a safe margin. Now, which point the controller decided to use was based on the current weather, and it would be reported to the pilots prior to commencing the approach so that they could set their minimus. In the UK, there was also a national rule known as approach ban. This rule basically stated that an approach could not be initiated if the reported visibility was below the minimum stated for the approach. This was to try and stop pilots from trying approaches when the visibility was too low and potentially make some bad mistakes. Now, in reality, it is always up to the commander of the aircraft to decide what approach can be flown or not, but the controllers could then report non-compliances with this rule to the authorities. On the ground in Coventry, the next load of livestock was loaded onto the aircraft, and at time 0452, the crew took off again towards Amsterdam, this time with the captain as pilot flying. Again, the flight was perfectly normal and they flew a successful ILS approach into runway 19 right and landed at time 0551. After the aircraft had taxied into the unloading platform in Amsterdam, the pilots received the updated weather for Coventry. The latest terminal area forecast, or TAF, now clearly indicated that fog with visibility around 800 meters was likely between 0400 and 0900 in the morning. This didn't bother the crew too much because the weather at their alternates were still good, and the company had asked them to upload tanker fuel to enable a subsequent flight down to Rennes in France without having to upload any more fuel in Coventry. So that meant that they would have loads of fuel on board. The final fuel count was recorded as 10,500 kilos, and the calculated burn for this sector was only 2,400 kilos. As the aircraft took off on this planned final sector at time 0642, the weather had already started to deteriorate in Coventry. The visibility dropped first to 3,500 meters in mist and then at 0620 to 800 meters in fog, in other words below the SRA minima of 1,100 meters. The captain was once again pilot flying on this flight with call sign ACE 702, and just like on the previous flight, they received the Coventry weather from London Control during their initial descent. This meant that as they were handed over to Coventry approach, they only received the runway visual range, or RVR value, of 700 meters and not the actual full weather report. The captain asked the first officer to request another SRA approach, which was granted, but this time it was flown all the way down to the minima without any visual runway contact being made by the crew. As the radar guidance terminated at half a mile from the runway, the captain executed a normal missed approach and climbed to 2,000 feet in accordance with the missed approach procedure. They then entered a holding pattern around the Coventry NDB, non-directional beacon, to plan their next move. Now, for those of you who have been paying attention, this approach should not have been flown at all, given the UK approach ban rule. It is a bit unclear if the pilots chose to disregard the ban or if they just weren't aware that it even existed, since it was a local UK restriction. In any case, the later evidence showed that this initial SRA approach had also been flown using the correct constant descent technique, just like the earlier approach had been. The pilots now started gathering weather information from their alternate airports. Birmingham, which was very close, had similar weather as Coventry with fog and low visibility, but East Midlands Airport was fine with a visibility of 3,500 meters in mist and scattered clouds at 6,000 feet. Since they still had loads of fuel on board, there was no immediate hurry to divert, and they decided to wait in the hold for at least 20 more minutes until 8 o'clock local time to see if there were any improvements. But at time 0749, Phoenix Aviation relayed a message to them, asking them to please divert to East Midlands and wait there instead. Now, this actually seemed like a good advice, since the weather on the ground below them was actually getting worse, with a visibility of just around 600 meters. But remember, the pilots had already been on duty for over 8 hours in long night flights at this point, so having to divert is tiring in itself, and it's really hard on the last sector in these kind of circumstances. So I completely understand why they wanted to wait and hopefully get back down and land at their base instead. Anyway, after having received that message, the pilots now notified air traffic control about their decision to divert, but were initially told to remain in the holding pattern. Here, the first signs of fatigue is starting to really show from the pilots. Because as they were told to remain in the holding pattern, the first officer asked the controller to repeat that message, as if he didn't quite understand it. And 3 minutes after that confirmation, at time 0753, the air traffic controllers suddenly saw how the aircraft exited the holding pattern without clearance and just started tracking towards their alternate East Midlands. This caused a potential conflict with inbound traffic to Birmingham, which the controllers quickly resolved, but an occurrence report was later filed from both Coventry and Birmingham control centres about this uncleared manoeuvre. Once the conflict was resolved, the aircraft received clearance to continue direct towards East Midlands Airport, and at time 0758, the crew was offered radar vectors towards an ILS approach for runway 27. Unfortunately though, the frequency of the ILS there was 109.35, again outside of the reach of their nav receiver, so the captain, who had now taken over the radio communications, advised that they were unable to get the ILS working at the moment, but that they would advise if they got the indication. We don't know if the captain had handed over the controls to the first officer for the diversion, or if he was just doing the radio and flying at this point. It is quite possible that he did, because this diversion was a bit outside of normal operations, and the captain's English knowledge was much better than the first officer's. When the aircraft was about 8.5 nautical miles away from the airport, the captain reported that they had the runway in sight, and they were subsequently cleared for a visual approach. The first officer again took over the radios from that point, and the aircraft landed safely in East Midlands at time 0808 and taxied into the apron. Once the aircraft was properly shut down, the captain got into contact with the Phoenix Aviation representative in Coventry. He was then advised that they would have to wait in East Midlands until the weather improved and then fly back again, since it was impossible to move the livestock down to East Midlands for the next transport. The crew was also told to head over to the restaurant and get some breakfast and keep checking the weather for updates. At this point, the pilots had already exceeded their max normal duty time, but since they had diverted, they could still operate a last sector according to the captain's discretion to recover the aircraft back to base. We don't really know how much discussions were made regarding this subject, but we do know that they ultimately took the fateful decision to keep operating. Here, it should be mentioned that back in 1994, crew resource management, or CRM training, was not yet mandatory in all airlines. In the case of Air Algerie, only the first officer had gone through a CRM course at the start of his training, but the captain still had not. CRM training is much more than just instructions on how to work well together in a team. It also includes things like fatigue and stress management, as well as self-evaluation and critique, and it's possible that this last sector might have been refused if the crew was more aware of how tired they actually were. Around 0900, a Phoenix Aviation representative looked outside of his window in Coventry and saw that the weather appeared to be improving. He called up the air traffic service unit in Coventry Tower, where a brand new service assistant was doing his very first day on the job. He gave an assessment of the weather as indeed improving, with a visibility of 1200 meters and a cloud base of 600 feet. But later, there was no official records found about this weather report, and instead, the official weather at the time was considerably worse, with visibility still below the minimums for the SRA approach. Unfortunately, the improving values was the weather that was being passed on to the captain, who used that as the basis for his decision to dispatch again for the short flight back to Coventry. And it was a very short flight. The straight line distance from East Midlands Airport to Coventry Airport was just 34 miles, which would mean an airborne time of less than 15 minutes. During extremely short flights like this, it's quite common for us pilots to brief both the departure and the approach on the ground prior to the flight. This would enable them to concentrate fully on the flight itself once airborne, but there was no indication that this took place before this particular flight. Instead, the first officer now again started setting up the cockpit for departure, this time with call sign ACE 702 Papa. The checklists were completed, and at time 0937, the 737-200 got airborne from runway 27 in East Midlands with its two cigar-shaped turbofan engines roaring into the crisp UK morning sky. The crew were initially cleared to maintain runway heading and to climb to flight level 40, which is around 4,000 feet. 40 seconds after takeoff, they were further cleared to turn towards the Coventry NDB and make two quick frequency changes. The captain was handling the radios, and these radio calls delayed the completion of the after takeoff checklist slightly, but soon the aircraft had retracted the flaps and was accelerated to 280 knots as they pointed the nose towards Coventry. This is a small but important point. First of all, the maximum speed in this type of airspace, below flight level 100, was 250 knots, but even that would likely have been far too fast in this type of situation. Accelerating the aircraft to its cruise speed of 280 knots was completely unnecessary for a distance of only 34 miles and shows some lapses of situational awareness already at this point, likely caused by fatigue or just willingness to get the flight over with quickly. A more sensible speed would have been around 220 knots or so, which would have enabled the pilots to take the weather and also to probably do a quick approach briefing. Now, we also don't know if the autopilot was used or if the first officer flew this whole flight completely manually. Like I mentioned before, the autopilot was really simple on the 737-200 and it only really had an altitude hold as well as an approach function that could be used for ILS approaches. This aircraft also lacked altitude bugs on the main altimeters, which could be used as visual reminders of the altitude minimums, and because of that, there was also no audible minimums warnings in the cockpit. Everything simply relied on the pilot monitoring calling those things out. As the aircraft got closer to Coventry, the air traffic controller asked them to change their transponder code and to continue flying towards Coventry NDB at flight level 40. The pilots asked if they could initiate their descent and were told to initially descend to 2,500 feet and to turn left onto heading of 110 degrees for vectors towards runway 23. This was correctly read back, the aircraft started turning and the pilots were advised that they were identified on radar. As this was going on, there was no approach briefing done in the cockpit, only a call from the captain to set 232, which was the inbound course for the SRA, likely to be set on their HSIs. And at this point there was also a short mention from the captain about the weather still being really bad. The descent and approach checklists had all been completed by the captain as soon as the after takeoff checklists were completed, but there was no indication that the last point on the approach checklist, altimeters and instruments, had actually been set. They also had not received any new full weather report at this stage, so they were still likely relying on the positive weather report that they had received on the ground a few minutes earlier. And the ATC controllers, who had received little warning of the aircraft coming into their airspace, did not give them the full weather either, because inbound flights normally would have received that from London Control, like in the previous flights. All of this meant that the aircraft was now getting closer to the approach, but without knowing that the visibility on the ground was still below minimums. Now, what could have given the crew some false assurance here was the fact that the fog was quite shallow, and it had indeed started thinning out in places. This meant that the aircraft was flying in clear skies as they were descending, and they likely could see the ground in between the patches of fog below them. The Coventry approach controller, who had now taken over the flight, told them in one long transmission to set QFE 1013. This was the pressure setting which was going to give them the height over the airport rather than the altitude over the sea, which was the standard procedure for this type of approach back in that time. And then to continue to descend to 1,500 feet and turn left heading 030 degrees. The captain read back the height and pressure setting correctly, but instead of 030 degrees, he read back 080 degrees. The controller heard this and told him to now please turn left to heading 010 degrees, which was read back as right turn to heading 010. Again, this was not correct, but the controller did not correct it because she could see that the aircraft had actually started turning left. These type of readback mistakes are quite good indications of potential fatigue when it comes from experienced flight crews like this one. Another sign of that came a few minutes later when the controller saw that the heading of the aircraft hadn't changed as expected and instead it was heading out to leave her radar area. She again called them up and repeated her request for a left turn to heading 010 degrees. The captain responded that they were indeed maintaining that heading, but the problem was that they were flying 100 degrees instead of 010 degrees, a full 90 degrees off. This was quickly rectified by the controller, who told them that she would be taking them through the extended center line for some extra spacing. She also asked if they were able to fly an ILS approach or if they needed an SRA. This seemed to confuse the captain, who asked what she meant by that message, and the matter was never really fully resolved. The controller instead assumed that an SRA would be required and started giving closing vectors for this by giving the crew a left turn to 260 degrees. She initially aimed to provide an SRA down to 2 nautical miles and relay this to the crew, who were also asked to check your minima and missed approach point. But that was never read back, because the captain responded with a request for a cooperation with an SRA approach, which the controller just confirmed that's actually what she was planning. This all meant that there was never a response to the controller's prompt to check minima and missed approach point, a fact that would become critical quite soon. The cockpit voice recorder picked up very little conversations between the two pilots during this whole flight duration, but what was picked up was several prompts from the captain regarding the first officer's flying, including when to reduce speed and start taking flaps, more indications of possible fatigue. As they were getting closer to the center line, they started configuring by first selecting flaps 1, then 5 and then 10. The captain at this point also mentioned that if they couldn't get down on the first attempt, they could just go around and try again, but to pay attention to the fuel. At that time they still had over 6,000 kilos in the tank, so they had plenty of fuel for several approaches and even a possible second diversion if needed. The aircraft was now closing in on the center line gently from the left, and at a 10 nautical miles final, the controller asked the crew to, at your convenience, check your wheels, which prompted the crew to select gear down, flap 15, after which they confirmed that the gear was down to the controller. As this was happening, the controller had decided to, instead of providing an SRA approach to 2 miles, she would continue to 1 mile instead, given the poor weather on the ground. But this decision was not communicated to the pilots. Taking that decision was the correct thing to do, but it would also enable a lower minimum descent height to be used, and if she would have communicated this to the crew, it might have reminded them about the minima and also to verify the current RVR, but that sadly didn't happen. Anyway, the controller now told the crew that they were now established on the center line and that they could start the descent from 1,500 feet and maintain a 3-degree glide slope once they passed 4.5 nautical miles. This was read back and acknowledged by the captain. Here now followed a really interesting discussion that might give an explanation to what happened next. The first officer said, "We can see the ground." And the captain responded that, "Yeah, well, from time to time, it's not always the case." The first officer then said, "Well, in patches." And the captain continued, "Otherwise, we can come here and try to get below the clouds." It's hard to know what the captain meant by that, but it could be an indication of an idea to try and dive and drive down below the fog banks and hopefully see the runway earlier that way. The controller kept giving heading corrections to follow, and the captain prompted the first officer to look at ADF1, which would be the NDB needle showing the centerline tracking, and also to promptly follow the controller's instruction. These were all signs that the first officer might be acting a bit slow in the captain's opinion. He also prompted him on speed, trying to reduce it back to 150 knots. As the aircraft passed 4.5 miles, the air traffic controller started with her continuous transmission, designed to guide the aircraft down towards the runway. From this point onwards, there was not much more discussions at all between the two pilots, but what instead happened was that initially the aircraft started descending according to the 3 degrees path, but from around 4 miles, the rate of descent suddenly increased to about 1,450 feet per minute, causing the aircraft to descend significantly below the intended path. Around this point is also where flaps 30 was most likely selected, which might have meant that the captain was busy completing the landing checklist and didn't monitor the descent rate too closely. As the aircraft entered the top of the fog bank at around 500 feet, the rate of descent was decreased back to around 750 feet per minute, which was almost exactly what a normal descent should be following a 3 degrees glide slope. But they were now significantly lower than they should be. There were no prompts heard from the captain who was pilot monitoring, possibly because he was now trying to peer out through the window and to see if he could see the runway through the clouds. The altitude messages from the controller had no meaning to the pilots at this point, since they were so far below them. It was likely just a distraction. If the idea from the crew was to try a dive and drive approach, well, then they would have needed to level off the aircraft at the decision height, but this height was never called out by the captain. During the steeper part of the approach, the aircraft's speed, indicated on the radar, had increased to around 175 knots, and with a tailwind of around 10 knots that was present at the time, this meant that the indicated airspeed must have been around 165 knots, also far above what they should have had at that point. The aircraft was no longer stabilized, but no one seemed to notice that. As the aircraft passed about 1.9 miles from touchdown, the descent rate again increased for some unknown reason, and the aircraft descended below the minimums. The controller continued to give radar instructions. Remember, she could not see the aircraft height, only its position on the center line, and just after the aircraft had passed 1.8 miles at time 0952, the power suddenly went out all over the airport. Within 10 seconds, the backup generators had gotten the radio back online, but the radar took a bit longer to boot up. Meanwhile, the controller called the aircraft up to check if they had a runway in sight, but there was only silence on the frequency. A call was then placed to an RVR observer who had been standing close to the threshold for runway 23, and he reported that he had heard the sound of jet engines followed by a large bang. What had actually happened was that the aircraft had descended so low that it had impacted an 86 feet high power pylon situated on the extended descent line at a distance of around 1.1 miles. This collision was what had actually caused the power outage on the airport. The aircraft impacted the tower in almost level flight, mainly with the left wing, and the impact ripped off several of the leading and trailing edge flaps, as well as causing severe damage to the left engine. Since the flaps suddenly disappeared together with the thrust from the left engine, the sudden loss of lift and asymmetric power led to an uncontrollable left roll. When the aircraft was at an almost wings vertical attitude, the left wing then slammed into the gable of a nearby house, which ripped off the left wingtip. The aircraft then continued its left roll until it was almost inverted before it crashed into a woodland just a small distance away from a large housing area. After the crash, the aircraft burst into flames and the forward and center part were almost instantly consumed by the fire. All 5 people on board were killed in the crash, but miraculously no one else on the ground was hurt. The investigation immediately started, and unfortunately the flight data recorder was found to be inoperative. There had been problems with it earlier on and it had been replaced, but it seems like the new recorder also started malfunctioning pretty quickly. The cockpit voice recorder was found to be working, but due to the noise level in the cockpit and the continuous radio transmission during the last part of the approach, it was very hard to get a proper reading from it. In any case, the investigation quickly found that the last SRA approach had been flown significantly below the intended path, and that there didn't seem to be much discussions or height checks going on in the cockpit. The captain, who was pilot monitoring, had missed to call out the decision height when it was reached, possibly because of the lack of altitude bugs or because he was just looking outside searching for the runway at that point. The ground proximity warning system was a reactive type that built on the radar altimeters, and because the aircraft was in a landing configuration and with quite modest descent rate, none of its activation thresholds had been met, so it never sounded. The cause of the accident was found to be a controlled flight into the terrain during approach, likely caused by fatigued pilots operating their 5th sector after over 10 hours of night duty and after having flown 6 approaches. Standard operating procedures, call-outs and stabilize criteria had not been observed during the fatal approach. The recommendations included changes to the phraseology used by ATC during SRA approaches, including notifications of the minima to be used, as well as better and more prominent SRA charts. The UK approach ban rule needed to be emphasized to foreign operators to make sure that the pilots of those airlines were aware of it, and it should also be mandatory for air traffic control to report the latest weather to approaching aircraft, or at least confirm that they have the latest ATIS at first contact. This is why you pilots out there always hear UK approach controllers ask for this when you call them up nowadays. Air Algerie was recommended to implement mandatory CRM courses for all of their crews, as well as implement a safety management system to more accurately track potentially dangerous trends inside of the airline. Now, I personally feel like this is an excellent example of the threat fatigue can cause and how easy it is to fall into the get-there-itis instead of just taking the safe but sometimes really laborious option. Crucially, if you're a new pilot out there and you're watching this, then make sure that you get proper rest before any duty you have. And if you feel impaired in any type of way, speak up. Now, check out any of these videos next, and please consider joining my awesome Patreon crew using the links in the description below. Or you can also support my work by buying a t-shirt, or if you feel like you need help with your fear of flying, then check out my new app.mentorpilot.com. It's awesome. Have an absolutely fantastic day. See you next time. Bye-bye.